Let's turn this morning to Acts chapter 15. We've been going through the book of Acts, and we have finally come to Acts 15, and we discussed it a couple weeks ago, how the Talmudim, the disciples from Antioch, send a delegation to Jerusalem to determine what is really required of them as Gentile believers. There are both Jews and Gentiles in Antioch, but this is particularly a problem that is coming up for Gentile believers because people have come from Jerusalem, they have gone to Antioch, and they have taught them according to their best understanding of what is required in the scriptures of Gentile believers, and they have basically put roadblocks in their way, even to the point of saying that those who are not Jewish need to become Jews, even if that involves for the men circumcision, in order to be saved. That is a grave problem, because, as we know, salvation is based not on our acts, not on our deeds. Even for Israel in the Tanakh, the salvation of Israel is not dependent on their deeds. The Torah was never meant as a means of salvation. It was always faith in God. And that is how Abraham was saved. It was by his faith, and God declared him righteous. And throughout the Tanakh, we have the reiteration that what does the Lord your God require of you but to love justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. As David says in Psalm 51, the Lord desires mercy rather than sacrifice. He desires our love and our obedience. That said, the Torah is still there. It is still the covenant between God and Israel, and it still has a relevance and a application to all the world, as in it is displayed the righteousness of God. So, of course, this is a really big issue for the early believers. They struggle with this, and they are troubled in their hearts because they are people who want to serve God. They are people who are being drawn to the God of Israel. As hopefully all of us here today are, we are here because we are being drawn to him. We are being drawn by him. And we want to be close. We want a good relationship with our God. And so this is the context of Acts chapter 15. And 2 weeks ago, as we went through the chapter, we came to the end of our section in verses 20 to 21, where the command for the church was to write that they should abstain from the contamination of idols, from sexual immorality, from what is strangled, and from blood. And we saw that not in that order, but those four requirements are the very same requirements of the stranger that is in the midst in Israel in Leviticus chapters 17 and 18. And so they concluded by saying, for Moses from ancient generations has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read in all the synagogues every Shabbat. And there's obviously a double entendre there. Obviously, these believers are close to Jewish people, and so there's an issue of social acceptability, but there's also the fact that to understand more about what is required of them as believers, there is the teaching that many of them were raised in in the synagogues, as even before the gospel came to Antioch and these other cities, they began to understand what God requires of those who are not Jewish. And to amplify that a little bit further, the synagogues were not proclaiming that everyone in the world should become Jewish in order to be saved either. That was not the Jewish method or message. But they allowed in their synagogues many gerim, God-fearers, people who were not Jews, but who wanted to worship the one true God of all creation. So that's our background. Joel Lieberman, who was at one point the president of the MJAA, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, which Canada used to be part of the MJAA. In fact, the first president of the MJAA was from Toronto, Shabtai Roholt, in 1915. So we have a long history with them, and we took our independence back in the 1970s, and now there's the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Canada, mostly inoperative at the moment, but nevertheless we did forge our own path. But Joel Lieberman was the president, and he wrote a commentary on Acts. It's basically based on his sermons on Acts, and he pointed out that this book also, especially in chapter 15, addresses many of the issues that we face in our Messianic Jewish context today, such as should non-Jewish men wear a tallis. These are issues that in the MJAA and in the UMJC, that's the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, that's the other main network of Messianic Jews in North America, that we had to struggle with and we had to work through. I think we came to the consensus in most congregations that Jewish men are encouraged to wear a tallis, but those who are not Jewish are not encouraged to, because the point is not to become more Jewish. The point is to become more like our Messiah. And yet, those of us who are Jews, we have our Jewish identity. Those who are Gentiles, we have our own ethnic identities, and we are all equal and we are all one. So this chapter that we're looking at this morning, Acts chapter 15, deals with this issue. If I might add a personal story, last weekend I was in Idaho, northern Idaho, very close to the Canadian border, in a town called Hayden. And anyone who knows about Hayden and Hayden Lake, and we were right next to the lake in the home where we were staying. My wife and I parked our little trailer in the driveway. Anyone who knows the history knows that that town had a neo-Nazi compound. Some neo-Nazis who owned a large parcel of property, and who were very active in disseminating their neo-Nazi anti-Semitic views, and actually racist across the board. So anyone who wasn't European white, as far as they were concerned, was second class. In that environment, you have a city that has been exposed to these radical and horrible, distasteful views. They fortunately got rid of these people by all kinds of legal maneuvers and through much difficulty finally got them out of the community. But nevertheless, for a Jewish person, going to a community like this that has for decades hosted neo-Nazis and is known for it, kind of makes you a little bit nervous. And at the wedding that I was partly officiating at, we had a Jewish wedding, but we had a Christian pastor who was licensed in Idaho to perform weddings there. And as we did our Jewish wedding, the Christian pastor tried to introduce more and more of his traditions and his distinctives. He had been somewhat receptive. I had told him, please don't use the word Christ. For a Jewish person, it hits us right here in the guts. It doesn't bring warm feelings to a Jewish person. And we had quite a few Jewish unbelievers there, family members, people who have been questioning the gospel and have been exposed to it. And we wanted to be a good witness. Nevertheless, somewhat untactfully, it seemed to others who told me afterwards, it looked as if this pastor was uncomfortable with the Jewishness of the ceremony. We'd had a chuppah. The bride walked 7 times around her bride, or her groom, 7 times around him. It's a tradition that we have from that has its roots back in Jeremiah, where it says, "A woman shall encompass a man." 7 blessings were said over the bride and groom according to Jewish tradition. They had the wine, drank from it, broke the cup. It was a Jewish wedding because she was Jewish. And nevertheless, people perceived that there was a kind of competition. Maybe this pastor from Hayden, Idaho, didn't know much about Jewish people and was uncomfortable, and it seemed to people that he was seeking to assert his Christianness. I suppose that's understandable, but it comes out of the same kind of issue that we are dealing with here in Acts chapter 15. How do we, as Jews and Gentiles, get together? And I think that the Gentile believers here in Antioch were far more like most of us here in the Kehillah, who are not Jewish, because the majority obviously in our Kehillah are not Jewish, who really have understood the Jewishness of the gospel and understood what God has done in and through Israel, and are willing to be blessed by that and encouraged by that in our faith, knowing again that we are all one in Messiah. There is no difference between us before God. So this is the background. They've got the command. Abstain from the contamination of idols, from sexual immorality, from what is strangled, and from blood. But now we see the heart of the people in Jerusalem in verse 22. Then it seemed good to the emissaries and elders with the whole community to choose men from among themselves to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They also sent Judah, also called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren, and this letter with them. Here is a community in Jerusalem that cares that the world should hear. They believe that Messiah is the King of all the world. And what they have witnessed as they have walked with Yeshua day by day, and as they have seen him suffer and die, and as they have seen him as the resurrected Lord, they realize that what he has done has relevance to everyone. That the salvation he is bringing is for the entire world. And they realize that this isn't something that they just should keep to themselves, just as we don't want to keep this good news that we have just to ourselves. We want it to go forth. And so they're not content with just telling Shaul or Paul and Barnabas and just simply telling them what this decree is. And remember, they came with a small delegation from Antioch, so there's quite a few of them. They're not going to just give the decree. They reach out. Now they want to go the extra step. They want to repair what has been damaged. And the insecurity of these early believers who have been taught now that you need to keep this rule and that rule, you need to keep the Torah, maybe you even need to be circumcised and convert to Judaism. They now are reaching out and seeking to repair the damage. And so Shaul and Barnabas have come to Jerusalem. They've gone up to Jerusalem, and they have come with a whole entourage, a bunch of people sent from Antioch. They come into the city. They've had this amazing discussion and counsel with the leaders in the Kehillah in Jerusalem. And now they are being sent back, not alone, but with Yehuda, also called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren. And in fact, earlier on in the verse 22, choosing men from among themselves to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas suggests that there were even more that were being sent to Antioch. They were sending a delegation back. This is going to be absolutely clear to the believers in Antioch that this is not just something where Shaul and Barnabas are able to tilt the scales in their favor, go to Jerusalem, get a decree, and come back with it. The people in Jerusalem were going to go back themselves to make it clear that God doesn't require all the things that these people in Antioch were being taught. And so this is the letter that they are going to send. They send a letter with them. The emissaries and the elders are the ones sending it. The apostles, in other words, the shlichim, as we say in Hebrew, and the elders of the congregation. And Jerusalem is being governed by these elders and by the shlichim, the emissaries. It's a big decision. It's a communal decision. And it is being done in unison to the Gentile brothers of Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. They are brothers, not just it. You can, when you talk to people, you can talk to them as objects. You can say, for example, these people are liberals, or you could say these people are Canadians like me. We can choose to make an us and them division in the way we might talk to people, if you were a conservative talking to a liberal or a liberal talking to a conservative. This is more polarized in the US than it is in Canada. But nevertheless, you can objectify people, or you can talk to them as if you are together in the same boat. And they say to the Gentile brothers, we are brothers. We are maybe different in our upbringing, different in our heritage, different in our history in regards to God's revelation to mankind. But we are brothers. To the Gentile brothers of Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, that's the area north of Israel. It includes Lebanon, what is Syria today, and southern Turkey. That whole region is being addressed in this letter. It's specifically for those who are troubled by this message that they might need to convert. And we read, this is the letter. We have heard that some from among us, and by the way, I'm reading from the Tree of Life version this morning. It's one of our excellent Messianic Jewish versions of the Scriptures. Since we have heard that some among us have troubled you with words disturbing to your souls, although we gave them no such authorization, it seemed good to us, having come to one accord, to select men to send to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. This is a letter of love. Many ancient manuscripts add the extra saying in verse 24, the words disturbing to your souls are that you must be circumcised and keep the law. Some manuscripts don't include that. It's an editorial decision to put that in the footnotes in this case. But we understand anyway from the concept of from the context of the chapter what was disturbing to them. But again, they bring this unity to the whole situation. We understand what is going on in your hearts. And these people didn't have our authorization, and they don't demonize them, because these people are probably acting in good faith. They're seeking to do the right thing according to their understanding. But now the Kehillah has come together, and they have heard from the Lord what they should do. And so they have one accord to select men to send to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. They're all together in on this. There's a big discussion. Was this whole trip to Jerusalem after the situation in Galatians chapter 2, where Rav Shaul stood up and confronted Peter to his face? Or did that happen afterwards, when he then had the basis to confront Peter and say, look, we have already decided and settled this issue? Either way, Kepha, Peter, is a part of this decision. They are all in this together. They are in unison, and beyond that, there is not only agreement, but there is love among them. Our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who've risked their lives for the name of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Verse 27, we therefore have sent to you Yehuda and Silas, who themselves will report to you the same things by word of mouth. It seemed good to the Ruach HaKodesh and to us not to place on you any greater burden than these essentials. So this unity has resulted in action. Here we have, in a sense, the real beginning of what we see as the global community of believers that we are all part of today. We are united with them. It really feeds into our relationship to other congregations in Vancouver and worldwide, because we are a Messianic Jewish congregation. But on the other hand, we understand that it is not an us and them situation in Vancouver either. There are some people who like to talk negatively about churches. They worship on Sunday, they do things differently than us. That happens sometimes. And we may have our differences, but at our Kehillah, we're actually very good at this, I think, and I'm pleased about it. We don't have that culture of saying us and them. We are in this together. And more so, the Ruach HaKodesh is part of this. They recognize that as they have come to their decision, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, has been a part of this, and He has spoken, and He has intervened in their situation and enlightened their ways. This is why the Ruach HaKodesh is mentioned in verse 8. The Ruach HaKodesh is the one who has drawn Gentile believers to God. And so the Ruach HaKodesh is part of this decision. There are many people who wonder, is the Ruach HaKodesh truly a person, just as the Son, Yeshua, is a person, just as the Father is a person? And here in Acts chapter 15 and verse 28, we see that the Ruach HaKodesh both has volition, he can choose, he can state, has a will. It seemed good to the Ruach HaKodesh. And that he has the authority to speak, and that is the authority to make decisions. Now, the Son himself said he speaks only on the Father's authority. But we know that all authority has been given to him in heaven and on earth. There's a relationship with the Father. Does what the Father has told him to do. He only speaks as the Father tells him to do. But nevertheless, he inherently has his own authority and his own power. And so it is with the Ruach HaKodesh. The Ruach HaKodesh comes after the Son leaves this earth and comes to comfort us and to guide us and direct us. So it seemed good to the Ruach HaKodesh and us not to place on you any greater burden than these essentials. And once again, the 4 essentials are mentioned. And interestingly, the record is a little different, which tells you actually that there's accuracy, and we know there is. We trust Luke, and we also trust the Ruach HaKodesh, who inspired Luke in the writing of the book of Acts. But there's accuracy that shows that in the earlier discussion, as James, or as we say in Hebrew, Yaakov, was speaking, he remembered from memory the 4 things that are required in Leviticus 17 to 18, but doesn't have the order correct in the written letter. When they are writing it and have time to think and check the scriptures and do their footnoting, so to speak, they get it all in order, exactly in the same order as Leviticus 17 and 18. Abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. By keeping away from these things, you will do well. Shalom. So there we go. The letter goes forth. The people now go from Jerusalem. And this is what we read in the next section, verses 30 to 35. Strengthening and rejoicing they go. Because this is the message. Now a crucial issue has been resolved. A good part of the book of Acts has led up to this. This is one of those crucial chapters. And now we see the message going forth. So when they were sent off, verses 30 to 35, strengthening and rejoicing, they went down to Antioch. And when they had gathered the whole group together, they delivered the letter. So they go down from Jerusalem. You always go down from Jerusalem because it is on high, both literally, physically, and spiritually. They go down from Jerusalem to Antioch. It's a few days' travel, but not too far. And they gather the whole group together. The group in Antioch is probably not numbered in the thousands. It's possible that it's not even numbered in the hundreds. This is very early days as the gospel is spreading. They could just be in the dozens, a few dozen of them, believers in the city of Antioch. The early believers are just beginning to see the gospel catch on. Remember in the previous chapters we've seen Shaul and Barnabas go to Cyprus, and then they went to Cilicia in the southern part of Turkey. They're just for the first time reaching out and expanding. So they gather the whole group together and they delivered the letter. And it says the people read it and rejoiced over its encouragement. That's a wonderful thing. They realize that there are people in Jerusalem who are taking note, people who care about them. They are encouraged, and they are also encouraged because now they understand it's not impossible for them to follow the Lord God of Israel and to please the Almighty. So they rejoiced, and Judah and Silas, prophets themselves, encouraged the brothers and sisters with a long message and strengthened them. So it must have been quite the day, a long message. They probably had to take breaks in the middle of it, but they understood the message that was being passed down from Jerusalem. Now they knew not just that Paul and Barnabas were bringing back a message, but the believers in Jerusalem cared to send members of their own, people who no doubt knew the very same people who had come and who had taught them that they needed to convert. but people who had specific authority to say, this is what God requires of you. And so they spent some time there, verse 33, and they were sent off with shalom by the brothers and sisters to those who had sent them. God works through pretty mundane things. This is a mundane, very straightforward transaction. An inquiry has gone to Jerusalem. From Jerusalem has come the answer. But in the way it is done, they show that God's Spirit is working within them, working between them, and working among the early believers in Antioch. And so the message has been given, and these people return. But then we read, but Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and proclaiming the word of the Lord with many others. And the many others is pretty important. Paul and Barnabas, but many others as well, were there from Jerusalem, teaching and proclaiming the word of God. As believers today, we can look at what is being taught here in the book of Acts, and we can be reassured that the real foundation of our relationship to God, whether Jew or Gentile, is not the Torah. On the other hand, the Torah does direct us in the ways of righteousness, but it needs to be clear. We're doing well when we come to him by faith and observe the stipulations of Acts 15. So then we come to verse 36. And this is the Besorah, the good news prevailing. The foundation has been laid for future blessing. So after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let's return and visit the brothers and sisters in every city where we have proclaimed the word of the Lord to see how they are. Now their vision turns outward. Now the big issue that needed to be settled has been determined and set in place. And so Barnabas was planning to take along John, called Mark. But Paul was insisting that they shouldn't take him along, the one who had deserted them in Pamphylia, not accompanying them in the work. And so here's another lesson. We've had earlier in the chapter now, we've seen how the brethren came together, how they came to unity, how they came to a decision together that included everyone and treated everyone with respect, and how the Ruach HaKodesh worked in that situation. The last part of this chapter kind of contrasts with that, intentionally or not. We see that here is another legitimate situation. Earlier on, Paul and Barnabas and John Mark had gone on a journey to bring the good news to various cities in southern Asia, in Cilicia and Cyprus. But John Mark had gone halfway, and we don't know why, but for some reason, either he felt he wasn't useful to them, or he just didn't like the hardships of the travel and of the road and the boats, maybe whatever it was, he decided to go back. And as far as Rav Shaul's concerned, he had deserted them. He had left them behind, he had failed, and whether or not Shaul liked John Mark, whether or not he got along with him, as far as he was concerned, that made him unfit for a second try. He doesn't want a second experience like this. He doesn't want someone unreliable going along with them. Doesn't mean he didn't forgive him. It's just, it's not coming on my trip this time. So Paul was insisting they shouldn't take him along. Barnabas, who is one who comforts and who cares for people, has a much more forgiving attitude and is willing to give him a second try. And so a sharp disagreement took place in verse 39, so that they split off from one another. Barnabas took Mark with him, sailed off to Cyprus, and Paul selected Silas and went out, being entrusted by the brothers and sisters to the gracious care of the Lord. And so here, there's a lot of things to unpack in a sense. First of all, Barnabas goes back on the same route that he had gone on with Paul and John Mark before and sails to Cyprus. They're going to retrace exactly what they did before. Whereas Shaul goes a separate way, and he goes straight for those cities where John Mark had never been seen. So that's interesting. They diverge. They decide not even to cross paths, separating entirely. Secondly, there's a lot of people who think that the Gospel of Mark was written by this John Mark, and that ultimately he matured, he grew in grace, and he grew in favor and with the Lord, and actually did something tremendous and helpful for the early community of believers and for us today. That's quite possible. But then the third thing we notice here is Paul selected Silas and went out, being entrusted by the brothers and sisters to the gracious care of the Lord. That didn't happen to Barnabas. So on one hand, Barnabas goes and he works with someone that Shaul is not interested in working with, and maybe that person grows up to be a huge contributor, not only to his own generation, but even to our day, writing the Gospel of Mark, which many people believe is the first gospel to have been written. But Shaul is the one who the people in Antioch bless, encourage, and sent out. It's quite a sharp division, but it also shows how God works, sometimes even through division. Because through this trip, God begins to build up the believers. And we read in verse 41, since Luke is following Shaul, Paul, and not anyone else, he just follows Paul and says, he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the communities. The Besorah, the good news prevails. God's will is done. Later on in chapter 16 and verse 5, we read that in Messiah's communities, they were strengthened in the faith and kept increasing daily in number. God was working. So God works even through our disagreements. God can work even when we don't see eye to eye. Sometimes we may never see eye to eye, but the Lord works anyway. Other times we can sense the Lord bringing a great sense of peace and unity, and we can see God working in our lives in a special way, and we can rejoice in that. It seems preferable. But God's will is done anyway. There is no plan B. Sometimes we make mistakes in our lives, and if you get to my age, as many of us have, there's none of us at my age who haven't made mistakes in their lives. We all have. And we think, maybe I'm on plan B. I could have done plan A, but I missed the boat. But God says, either way, He uses us. It's all in His plan. His overall plan always goes ahead. There is no plan A or B in God's mind, because He knows the beginning from the end. He knows where we're going. He knows what He wants to accomplish through us, even when we don't. And even our slip-ups, He understands and knew that they were going to happen, but he also works through them and brings about his perfect purpose. So we have a great God we can rejoice in. And the book of Acts, chapter 15, tells us that.